King and pawn versus king. The capture of a pawn in the middle game by no means ensures victory. But it is different in the ending, where an extra pawn is an important advantage. Frequently the player who wins a pawn gradually exchanges all the pieces and steers the game into a pawn ending, where the advantage of one pawn is usually sufficient for win. Play quite often boils down to king and pawn against a lone king. Let us take a look at some different types of such endgames. 1. The opposing king is driven away and the pawn queens all by itself. If you want to know whether black's king can catch up with the pawn, you do not have to count the moves. There is a special method for that, the rule of the square. The king stops the pawn if it is within a quadrate whose side is equal in length from the square on which the pawn stands, b3, to the square of the pawn's promotion, b8. The quadrate formed by the pawn on b3 is indicated in diagram by highlighted squares. During play it can be easily imagined. With white to move, after. If in this example it is black's move, then by playing as also
King, g7.
Or
King, g8. King, g6.
Black enters the quadrate and easily captures the pawn.
b4.
A new quadrate is formed. Now black's king is no longer capable of entering this quadrate on his move and hence cannot catch up with the pawn. It should be borne in mind that the pawn can move 2 squares ahead from its initial position. This should be taken into consideration in applying the rule of the square. 2. The opposing king is too near for the pawn to be able to queen by its own efforts. The opposition of king has an important bearing on the outcome of such endings. In the situation shown in this diagram, the result of the game depends on whose turn to move is. If it is white's move, then she is compelled to pull back the king, losing the opposition, or to play. If it is black's turn to move, then she is forced to abandon the opposition.
King, e8.
And after.
e7. King, f7. King, d7.
White queens and wins.
e7. Check. King, e8. King, e6.
In stalemate. Thus, if it is white's move, then the result is draw, and if it is black's move, then white wins. This is a typical example of mutual zugzwang, when it is disadvantageous for either side to move first. Now let us examine a case where the pawn is farther away from the last rank. In this position black achieves a draw by occupying the opposition all the time.
d4. Check. King, d5. King, d3. King, d6.
Attention should be paid to this move. Black retreats in such way that helps to retain opposition no matter where white's king goes.
King, e4. King, e6. d5. Check. King, d6. King, d4. King, d7. King, c5. King, c7. d6. Check. King, d7. King, d5. King, d8. King, e6. King, e8. d7. Check. King, d8.
Draw. Employing the same tactics, the weaker side easily achieves a draw in the following positions as well, irrespective of whose move it is. The following conclusion may be drawn. If the king of the stronger side is behind the pawn or next to it, while the king of the weaker side is in front of the pawn not letting the opposing king through, then the game ends with draw. 3. The king stands in front of the pawn. If the king of the stronger side can pass ahead, so as to pull the pawn along behind itself, then the win comes quite easily as a rule. White wins by pushing his king forward. But not.
F4. King, F7. King, E3. King, F6. King, E4. King, E6.
Withdraw.
King, D1. King, E3. King, E7. King, E4. King, E6. King, F4. King, F6. F3.
This important reserve move that white has at his disposal compels black to give up the opposition.
King, G6. King, E5. King, F7.
Again not.
F4.
Because of.
King, E7. F5. King, F7. King, F5. King, E7. King, G6.
Or.
King, E6. F4. King, E7. F5. King, F8. King, F6. King, G8. King, E7.
And white wins.
King, F8. King, F6. King, G8. F4. King, F8. F5. King, E8. King, G7. King, E7. F6. Check.
And white wins. In the diagrammed position, the outcome depends on whose turn to move it is. If it is white's move, then the game ends with a draw. If black is to move, then she has to retreat, losing the opposition.
King, G7. King, E6. King, F8. King, F6.
And white wins.
King, E5. King, E7. F5. King, F7.
Etc.
F6.
All the above applies to pawns on any file except those on the edges. In the case of AR pawn, the king of the weaker side only has to reach the corner square to achieve draw. It is easy to see that the stronger side cannot oust the king out of the corner, while the advance of the R pawn up to the 7th rank leads only to a stalemate. In both positions the result is a draw. The advance of the pawn leads to stalemate.
King, A6. King, B8. King, B6. King, A8. A5. King, B8. A6. King, A8. A7.
Stalemate.
King, H8. King, F8.
Black does not let white's king out and keeps on repeating the moves, while the advance of the pawn to H7 result in a stalemate.
H7.
Conclusions. Victory is achieved in the following instances. A. The opposing king is far away, so that the pawn itself queens. B. The king of the stronger side occupies a square on the 6th rank, ahead of the pawn. C. The king of the stronger side, with the opponent's turn to move, stands in front of the pawn and is in opposition. Draw occurs in the following cases. A. When there is AR pawn, if the king of the weaker side gets into a corner square or locks the king of the stronger side into a corner, diagram 1 and 2. B. The king of the weaker side stands on the square in front of the pawn and does not let the opposing king pass. C. The king of the stronger side, with white's turn to move, stands in front of the pawn but the opposition is maintained by the opponent and there is no alternative move for the pawn.